Everybody, welcome to Conserving Catholicism. My name is Nick.
I'm Adam.
And thank you for tuning in for today's episode. We have a very different episode for you. Today is the first episode of our Devil's Advocate series, in which Adam and I will be picking a topic, and it could be philosophical, theological, political, and one of us will be arguing from the more Catholic or conservative perspective, and the other will be the devil's advocate and arguing against the position. And this is just a great opportunity for us to, one, to practice our intellectual faculties and trying to see if we can really think about some of these things more in depth, and for the other to really just get in the seat of an opposing viewpoint and, as best as we can, try to steelman the position, because of course we want to be as politically honest, as intellectually honest as possible, and really try to show the best out of both viewpoints. So for today's topic, we have, is it reasonable to believe in God? That is our question. And arguing in the affirmative, arguing for the more Catholic position, will be Adam for tonight, and arguing in the negative will be me, and I will be arguing why it is unreasonable to believe in God. So Adam, if you want to share with us the structure for tonight's episode, and this might be the same structure going forward. It really depends on the feedback we get from it. If you guys really like the way this is, let us know and we'll continue it. And if not, we might tweak it and change it up a little bit. It's still a work in progress, but Adam, if you want to take it away, go ahead.
Absolutely. So the structure is as follows. The affirmative, in this case, myself, will prepare an introduction and argue, in this case, that the reasonableness of believing in God, and then the negative will respond. Both of those will be 10 minutes each. We have a maximum. All of these timestamps, by the way, are maximum time, so we are under no obligation to meet that time, but we cannot go over. And then after the negative response, the negative 10-minute response, there will be a rebuttal from the affirmative. That'll be a max of 5 minutes, and then there'll be a rebuttal from the negative, a max of 5 minutes. And then a cross-examination each with a max of 3 minutes, and then a general discussion afterwards. That'll be approximately 10 minutes. That'll be a little bit less structured. We're just going to see where it goes afterwards. So I planned on just timing myself. I would like to see the time in front of me. So we'll do the honor system, and you'll definitely hear the bell go off on our phones, just in case we go over. So with that being said, I think I'm up first, arguing for the reasonableness of believing in God. So in normal debate fashion, once we start talking, we'll just click our own timers and we off to the races. So, and
for just so that way you all know, for the rest of the debate, I will be assuming the negative position. So these are not necessarily my views, but I will be trying to be in the character of those who would hold these views. But before I get into that mindset, Adam, I just want to say Godspeed.
Thank you.
I look forward to this debate discussion.
Awesome. Well, best of luck. Okay, well, let's see here. Well, after a brief technical delay, we are all set to go. Let me just get my timer ready and we'll get going. All right. So the proposition before us tonight is whether or not it is reasonable to believe in God. I will be arguing in the affirmative. The first step we must take is to evaluate the components of the issue at hand. In this case, the respective definitions of reasonable belief and of God. As for the former, I contend that a reasonable belief is one that is grounded in rational justification by way of argument. Such argument, whether in the form of one argument or a family of arguments, must be devoid of any blatant falsehoods, inconsistencies, or logical fallacies. Suffice it to say that my definition of reasonable belief fits squarely with the everyday use of the term. Nevertheless, the notion of reasonableness and standard of proof is something to which I will return at the end of my opening statement. Turning now to the definition of God, my position tonight will be to defend the God of classical theism. In this philosophical and theological tradition, God is defined not as a being, one thing among many in the universe, but the ground of being itself. As a metaphysically necessary entity, God is also conceptualized as one, immutable, eternal, immaterial, incorporeal, perfect, omnipotent, and fully good. As we shall soon see, the argument I have to offer meets both the standard of reasonable belief that I have set out and succeeds in demonstrating that the God of classical theism does indeed exist. Now on to the argument itself. The following argument is a condensed form of Ed Feser's Aristotelian proof for the existence of God, which is then based on St. Thomas Aquinas' famous argument from change. It proceeds as follows. Premise 1, change exists. Premise 2, change is the actualization of a potential. To give a quick example, this could be a cup of coffee cooling down on your desk. This could be a leaf falling from a tree, the side of your car rusting, anything that has an actualization of a potential in the object itself. Premise 3, no potential can actualize itself. Premise 4, any change is caused by something that is actual. And the following two premises are corollaries to the preceding two. Premise 5, the occurrence of any change C presupposes some things or substance S which changes. Premise 6, for any change C, there must be an already actualized substance A that causes such a change in S. Now getting to the heart of the argument. Premise 7, A's own existence at the moment it actualizes S itself presupposes either A, the concurrent actualization of its own potential for existence, or B, A's being purely actual. To clarify, by concurrent actualization is meant anything by virtue of its own existence is actualized in the manner of existing. So for any X that exists, its potential for existence is either derived from itself or from some other actualized existence outside of itself. Premise 8, if A's existence at the moment it actualizes S presupposes the concurrent actualization of its own potential for existence, then there exists a regress of concurrent actualizers that is either infinite or terminates in a purely actual actualizer. In other words, actualized things in themselves do not have the causal power to sustain their own actuality. Premise 9, since an infinite regress of concurrent actualizers is impossible, conclusion, there must exist a purely actualized actualizer, namely God. Now, before moving on to a brief overview of how divine attributes of classical theism follow from this argument, it is worth summarizing the main thrust of the Aristotelian proof as I've just laid it out. I know there's a lot of premises and detail in there. So to recap, change exists and is defined by the movement from potentiality to actuality. This is not only true in a temporal sense when, say, an ice cube melts or a plane descends from the sky, but also and most crucially in a hierarchical sense. For anything that exists is exhibiting change insofar as its existence represents actuality. What is needed is something to sustain the existence of any given thing. Note that this actuality of existence can only be derived from something else that is already actualized, and that actualizer needs an already actualized thing to sustain it, and so on and so on. So the existence of all things, taken both individually and collectively, represents an actuality that necessarily needs an actualizer. This is the case because hierarchical actualizers do not possess the causal power to sustain their own existence. They derive this from other actualized things, which are themselves causally effete in the hierarchical sense, strictly speaking. Therefore, we are in metaphysical need of a pure form of actuality with the power of actualizing, hence the actualized actualizer. We are now in a position to briefly state why pure actuality exhibits the classical theistic attributes. Immutability or unchangeability. Pure actuality excludes potentiality. Since change is the movement from potentiality to actuality, change is an impossibility. God is also eternal for the simple reason that being bound by time implies temporal change. God simply is. God is also immaterial and incorporeal necessarily, since material is changeable and exists necessarily within time. God is neither. This actualizer is neither of those things, and in fact, in principle, has to be without. Perfection. Imperfection implies the privation of the means to achieve one's proper ends. In other words, a failure to achieve some potentiality. Since God does not possess, or this actualized actualizer that we're calling God does not possess any potentiality, it's in principle impossible for imperfection to occur. Omnipotence. Power is the ability to make something happen. Pure actuality is in principle the fount and sustenance of all that can be done. This is, strictly speaking, the most powerful thing one can imagine. Finally, the last two, God is one. This is a quote from Feser himself. He says it better than anyone. Quote, there could not be multiple actualizers, not even in principle, for there can be two or more of a kind only if there is something to differentiate them, something that one instance has that the others lack. And there can be no such differentiating feature where something purely actual is concerned. Thus, we typically distinguish the things of our experience by their material or temporal features, by one thing being larger or smaller than another, say, or taller or shorter than another, or existing at a time before or after another. But since what is purely actual is immaterial and eternal, one purely actual thing could not be differentiated from another in terms of such features, end quote. And lastly, for the divine attributes, God is fully good. Drawing from our notion of perfection we established earlier, we can say that what is not deficient or lacking is qualitatively better than what is deficient or lacking. God, as pure actuality, cannot be lacking or deficient in any way. Now, in a shocking turn of events, I'm going to conclude with a kind of devil's advocate within a devil's advocate. I personally, and many others, find the Aristotelian proof, among other arguments, to be compelling cases for belief in God. I think it succeeds magnificently, in fact. But note, all arguments include premises, just by virtue of being an argument. And premises really are just claims in their own right, requiring their own justification by way of independent argument. For example, detractors from the Aristotelian proof, such as Graham Oppy and Joe Schmid, take issue with the premise that whatever exists must either rely on concurrent actualization or must itself be purely actual. Schmid, in particular, argued that there is justification for the metaphysical view known as the preliminary existential inertia thesis, say that 5 times fast, which would all but undercut this crucial premise of Feser's argument. Though this broader metaphysical dispute lies well beyond the scope of my opening argument, as well as just my general abilities, it is worth remembering that plausible arguments are the only beginning stages of a compelling case. All this is to say that reasonable minds can indeed disagree when it comes to formal arguments, and perhaps more importantly, the premises that comprise the foundations of such arguments. Thus, the standard of proof for reasonable belief is far more modest than a first impression may indicate, and I've resolved that when it comes to belief in God, there is ample room to make the conclusion that belief is indeed warranted. And with that, I will yield the rest of my time to the good sir across from me virtually.
Thank you, Adam. That was really great. Glad to see Feser making a comeback into
Absolutely.
this discussion. So I'll begin with my opening statement. Hello, everybody. Thank you again for joining us for this first episode of Devil's Advocate, and thank you, Adam, for allowing me to play the part of the bad guy in this discussion. I feel right at home and like I am where I'm supposed to be. For tonight's debate, Adam and I are discussing the question, is it reasonable to believe in God? It is important to emphasize that the question is not, does God exist? Therefore, what I am attempting to do today is not to argue that God does not exist, but to argue that belief in God is not reasonable. Moreover, I will not be arguing that it is reasonable to believe that no God exists. Thus, the position I will be taking during this debate will be that it is unreasonable to believe in the existence of God, just as it is unreasonable to believe in the non-existence of God. I will try to argue that one must take an agnostic approach to the question and admit that they simply cannot know the truth value of the claim God exists. So first, what do we mean by God? According to the classical theistic conception of God, which the Catholic Church and Catholic philosophers and theologians defend, God is completely simple and pure being itself. Rather than being one being among many, God is being itself, which actively sustains and conserves all things in existence. If this already seems to be getting a little difficult to understand and too abstract to follow along, you're not alone. It almost seems inconceivable to imagine what being itself would consist of and what that would even mean. When discussing how God is known by us in question 12 of the first part of the Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas Aquinas addresses in Article 4 if, quote, whether any created intellect by its natural powers can see the divine essence, end quote. In his Respondio Decendum, or I Answer That, in Article 4 of the Summa, Thomas states, quote, it is impossible for any created intellect to see the essence of God by its own natural power, for knowledge is regulated according as the thing known is in the knower. But the thing known is in the knower according to the mode of the knower. Hence, the knowledge of every knower is ruled according to its own nature. If therefore the mode of anything's being exceeds the mode of the knower, it must result that the knowledge of the object is above the nature of the knower, end quote. This brings me to my first argument against the reasonability of belief in God. It is unreasonable to believe in God because he cannot be known by us in principle. St. Thomas Aquinas, a defender of classical theism himself, admits that by man's own natural powers for reasoning, man cannot see the divine essence. This is because for something to be known, the thing known exists in the mind of the knower, in the mode of the knower. However, the mode of God exceeds the mode of the mind of man. Thus, man cannot have knowledge of God since he is above the nature of man. Moreover, among Christian philosophers and theologians, there are two ways one can speak about God. First, in the via negativa, or the apophatic way, and second, in the via positiva, or the cataphatic way. The via negativa are statements about God that speak about him in a negative way. This is not to say that they speak about God badly or poorly. Rather, speaking about God in the via negativa is to say what God is not. For example, God is immaterial, not made of matter. God is incorporeal. He does not have a body. God is immutable. He is unchanging, and so on and so forth. On the contrary, to speak about God in the via positiva is to speak about him in a positive way. For example, God is omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, omnipresent, etc., etc. While many speak about God using both ways, some prefer the via negativa because it speaks of God in more concrete and literal terms that can be more easily understood. On the other hand, the positive way is more abstract and harder to understand. This is why St. Thomas Aquinas says, when speaking about God in the via positiva, that we can only understand these attributes in an analogical sense. When we speak about God as being good, he is not good in the same way that we as humans are good. We are not using good in an entirely equivocal way, that is to say, a completely different way either, but it is not univocal or exactly the same. This is because we cannot fully comprehend the kind of good that God is or the kind of knowledge God has of himself or the universe. Thus, any positive statements we make about him are necessarily going to fall short in our language and understanding. However, if we in principle cannot understand these attributes of God due to our finite nature, it cannot be said that we actually know him in any meaningful sense of the term. We know of God, but only in a very removed way. However, if we in principle cannot fully know or understand the essence of God, how can we say that it is reasonable to believe in what we cannot fully comprehend? For if we were to fully comprehend what God is, he would exist in the mode of the knower, that is us, and then he would cease to be God. St. Thomas Aquinas responds that although we cannot know God by our natural powers, we can come to know him through grace. In other words, by God's grace can our knowledge of God be elevated so that we can come to know him. However, if this is used as a defense that it is reasonable to believe in God, it would almost seem to be begging the question. For how do I know a person has been given grace to see the essence of a being who I myself cannot sufficiently comprehend by my own powers? And if that be the case, wouldn't it only be reasonable for me to believe in him if he gave me the grace to see his essence? And if so, why hasn't he given me that grace? In layman's terms, if the divine essence could not be seen or comprehended by our own powers, which Aquinas agrees with in question 12, article 7 of the Summa, how are we expected to believe in him? If God, an infinite being, could be fully comprehended by man, a finite being, he would cease to be God in any meaningful sense. I'd like to be very clear here that my argument is not that we should not believe in God because we do not know him. Rather, we should not believe in God because in principle we could not know him by our own powers. Here's a helpful syllogism to understand the argument. A. If a concept in principle cannot be comprehended by human minds, it is unreasonable to believe in the concept. B. The God of classical theism is a concept that, in principle, cannot be comprehended by human minds. C. Therefore, it is unreasonable to believe in the concept of the God of classical theism. Another argument I'd like to pose against the reasonability of belief in the God of classical theism has to do with some of the internal contradictions of the God of classical theism. For the sake of time, the internal contradiction I'd like to focus on has to do with God's perfection. If God is perfect, it would seem to follow that God cannot make anything that is imperfect, for that would be an imperfection itself. However, we can see that the world contains many natural imperfections. While the free will defense is often posed against the moral evils, free will hardly accounts for natural evils or imperfections that we see in the world. Free will cannot account for why some children may be diagnosed with cancer, why people die in hurricanes or other natural disasters, or why many people have natural bodily defects such as blindness or deafness. It would seem that an all-perfect God would make a perfect creation. It could be objected that God may not create but allow for some of these natural evils to occur in order to bring about a certain good. However, given some types of natural evils that occur, it seems very improbable that any greater goods come from them. Take, for example, William Rowe's example of a fawn who is burned in a forest fire and suffers in agony for 3 days before eventually succumbing to its wounds. During those 3 days, no human being found the fawn and was able to tend to it. It seems improbable that any good could have come out from the fawn's needless suffering. Some theists may retort that it is impossible to know for certain that these evils do not bring about greater goods, without which those goods cannot be achieved. However, many theists, including those that argue for the God of classical theism, believe in a heaven in which there is no suffering or evil at all, and all who enter can experience infinite good. Therefore, if that can be imagined, why is it not the case that we can experience an infinite amount of good without any kind of evil in this world now? Thus, this is what many would call the why not heaven now objection. Given this apparent contradiction, and many more that I have not been able to address here within the thought of classical theism, it does not seem to be reasonable to believe in God. And at this moment, I will concede the rest of my time and get to Adam's rebuttal.
All right, a lot to cover there. And Nick, thank you for that awesome first statement. So I'll try to take each of your arguments in turn. I definitely want to address them, but first let me set my timer so I don't break my own rules that I've set forth. So, all right, timer starting now. 5 minutes is too short of a time, but anyway, I'll get to it. So it seems to me that you are equating full comprehension of a subject with your definition of reasonableness that you present in your syllogism. I find this to be troubling because there are many possible objections to this, things that we conceptualize, we talk about, we operationalize, that we can't even in principle have full comprehension of. The most classic example would be the idea of infinity, or you use transfinite numbers, any of the various theories of infinity around there. The idea of comprehending that as a whole, the idea of like an infinite set, for instance, is kind of absurd, but we still operationalize it in the discourse of mathematics. And we circumlocute and we have stand-in terms and by proxy, like you say, and Aquinas points this out very correctly, is that all we can do is analogize. And I want to make it very clear that the classical theist position, again, as you make clear, doesn't claim that you can have a full comprehension of God, but having that being the standard for which you could say, I believe in something, doesn't seem to me to hold. A couple of other examples of things that we can't possibly, or at least it would be a little bit absurd, is that we fully comprehend are aesthetic concepts such as art and music, the experience of beauty, the phenomenology of beauty, for instance. We use circumlocution, we use stand-in proxy phrases in order to describe the experiences, often very powerful experiences, and have a full comprehensive rational grasp on these is nearly impossible, yet we still claim to comprehend them, and we can talk about them and understand them, and indeed we believe in them by virtue of that discussion. And even more generally speaking, on the kind of the phenomena, intentional states and aboutness are other such concepts that, again, we call it aboutness, and it's always put in scare quotes because we don't actually really know what we're talking about, yet we can still discourse about it in terms of phenomenology. So those would be a couple of things I would offer. That I guess my main rejection to your first line of argumentation is that we have to have full comprehension in order to believe and or talk about something. So I wish I had more time, and I'm going to try to address your second point, not because I'm about halfway through my time here. So your second line of reasoning essentially renders down to that God cannot make imperfections, and also the why heaven now objection. One is I would thoroughly reject the claim that natural evil should be called evil, although it is generally emotionally undesirable to us. The fawn in the wood story, for instance, doesn't have an active will, so far as we know, involved, and so I would be very suspect in calling that an act of evil. However emotional of a reaction we have on that. Same thing with the why not heaven now. Again, if we necessarily abstract the concept of God from any particular religious tradition, we can make God and what we think God would do. We can transplant any of our ideas of what we think God could do. But once you deracinate God from any particular religious tradition, then that objection, I agree, holds. However, if one was arguing from a Christian or even a Jewish or Muslim perspective, one would have to tend to what one would expect given the tradition itself, and the Christian tradition especially, where there are very specific theological and even indeed historical reasons why heaven doesn't occur now. So I would just appeal to, if there's a specific contradiction within the specific tradition of, let's say, Christianity for the purposes of this conversation, then I think that would be a more powerful objection. But just talking about God in general doesn't really succeed, because one could foresee using God in really any which manner he chooses. So I think I'm just about out of time. Yeah, I got about 40 seconds left. So with that, I'm going to yield, and I'd be more than happy to entertain your next rebuttal. So please.
Thank you, Adam. I'll start my time now. So first of all, I'll try to address some of the points made in your introduction, and then I'll try to address some of the rebuttal points, although we have some time later on to discuss those things. So for the first thing I want to address is the second premise of Fraser's argument that change is the actualization of a potential. I think that it's self-evident to say that change exists in the world, but it's not self-evident to say that change is the actualization of a potential. So that seems to be an assertion in that one that needs more proof behind it, because I can clearly see when change happens in the world, but I don't see exactly a potential being actualized. And that, I think, would need some more evidence to show that, yes, every instance of change is this actualization of a potential. Moreover, there are different kinds of change in the world that even classical theists admit. So there's change in motion, change in color, change in time. And so it doesn't seem like it would be illogical for there to be different first causes for different kinds of change that are in the world. Since if it's a different change, why would it not be a different cause that causes that change? The other thing I wanted to bring up was you brought up God's immutability. And it's something I didn't get to bring up in my introduction, but I think that there's another possible contradiction in there, in that God is supposed to be absent of any change. But of course, when God, before he creates the world, before he creates the universe, he is not a creator. But as soon as he creates the world, he goes from changing from being not a creator to being a creator of the universe. And so there is a change. He's potentially the creator of the universe, and then he actually becomes the creator of the universe. And so I think that his immutability leads to certain self-contradictions, including especially with his free will. If he is unchanging and cannot change, it seems that God cannot truly be free as well, because he can only be what it is that he has to be, and can only do the certain things that he must do. In regards to some of the points that you brought up, I want to clarify that my argument is not that we ought not to believe in things that we do not fully comprehend, but that we shouldn't believe in things that in principle we couldn't comprehend. So even with things like aesthetic judgments or things in mathematics or moral judgments, there's nothing within those concepts, even from an agnostic viewpoint, that you can say that claims that those things in principle cannot be comprehended. We might not fully comprehend them yet, but in principle, there's nothing incoherent about them, or things that we know fall short of human knowledge. And even in regards to things like aesthetic judgments or moral judgments, there are definitely plenty of naturalistic viewpoints of why we consider things to be aesthetically pleasing, or why we consider things to be good. Not to say the least of psychological factors, in which there might be psychological reasons for why we strongly believe that certain things possess beauty and other things do not possess beauty, or why maybe they don't possess it, but why we find them to be beautiful. And so there would definitely be plenty of naturalistic explanations that say we do actually fully comprehend what those aesthetic judgments are and what those moral judgments are. But even if one did not subscribe to those, there would still be the case that nothing about them, no one has ever argued that those things in principle could not be comprehended. So I believe that the door still is open there. And I think in regards to that, I think the only thing I would say is with the why heaven now objection. I don't think that and maybe during the cross-examination or during the open discussion, we can go into it a little bit more, but I didn't hear exactly, I guess, the main case against it. I know that there were some theological objections to it, but I would say that at that point, we then reach out of the realm of philosophy. And so once we get into theological objections, I would need to then already be believing in all these theistic conceptions, or even these Christian, Jewish, Muslim conceptions of God, which I haven't subscribed to. So I think that if we are not able to address it on philosophical grounds, it might be more difficult to try to buy into that conception of why the why heaven now objection is a poor objection. But with that, I'll yield the rest of my time.
Okay, sorry, I was just writing something down. All right, I'll start my cross-examination. So I'm going to go back to this question of infinity, just because it was the first thing that popped into my head. So I wish I had more time to work it out. But do you think that the concept of the set of all natural numbers can be fully comprehended by the human mind?
I think that it's possible that in principle, the set of all natural numbers could be comprehended by the human mind. And that would be because I think that given an infinite amount of time, we would still be, the human mind would be able to comprehend all the set of natural numbers. But of course, since we are finite in our time, we don't have that ability to do so now. So it's not that there's any shortage of our being to be able to comprehend those, but it's just because it's not a logical contradiction to be able to understand those things.
Do you see any merit in the claim that in principle, again, according to classical theism and particularly the Catholic tradition, that in principle we can know God through other things rather than through rational means? And do you count those as legitimate or not, and why?
Can you rephrase it one more time? Just
so your big objection is that God in principle cannot be known through rational means. Therefore, we should not believe. Do you think that there are other principles by which we can come to believe in God that are not strictly speaking rational or sought by way of argumentation?
Well, I think that the main objection is not that we can't know him through just pure rationality, but that by definition, God as being itself can't be comprehended. So just a priori, it seems that if that's the definition of God, that we can't come to know him. But I do think, and St. Thomas Aquinas mentions that we could come to see the essence of God if he were to give us his grace to elevate our knowledge to them. And so if God did exist, it may be possible to come to know him through his own revelation. But without that, it doesn't seem like it's likely that we can know him by any natural means, and thus I don't see why it's reasonable to believe in him when we can't know him through any natural means.
So you see it as you have to commit yourself first to, or would someone have to convince you of supernaturalism before you could even begin to accept in principle that through God's revelation we can come to know God? Would that be the way to approach it? You'd set up a default.
Even if I were to buy the premise of supernaturalism, I would still need to then figure out how I can come to know of a being that I can't even know of in principle, and how supernaturalism could help me any further along that lines.
Okay, well, my 3 minutes for cross-examination is up, so
all right,
all yours.
Great. So let me start real quick before I go ahead. Okay. So the first question I'd ask, do you think God is a necessary being?
Yes, metaphysically necessary.
Okay. So is he necessarily a cause of the universe?
Yes. Well,
okay.
Actually, let me rephrase. God is a metaphysically necessary being. The ontological status of the universe only comes into play through the pure will of God. So it's not necessary that we exist. I should have rephrased that, or that the universe exists as a whole.
So would you say then? God could have chosen not to make this universe,
yes,
if he wanted to. Okay. Do you think that if God wanted to, he could have made a universe without imperfections?
I believe in principle you could have. And if your follow-up question is why, is that your follow-up question?
Yeah. I guess the follow-up question would be if he could have made a universe without imperfections, why didn't he make a universe without imperfections?
Again, I would point to, and you mentioned this kind of blurring of lines as an objection between theology and philosophy. And I would say that as you can use, so long as it's rationally justifiable, evidence from a specific tradition, let's say the historical claims of Christianity or the moral claims of Christianity, depending on various theological, philosophical, historical arguments in support of why we don't live in a quote unquote perfect universe. But I maybe we can get to this later, but I have trouble with the establishing of what a perfect universe would look like. I don't exactly know what that means.
Um, in regards to heaven, do you regard heaven as being a perfect world?
I'm trouble with the idea of world. Again, I'm not familiar, not as read up on the concept of heaven, but it definitely is more of a, I would describe it as a state, better described as a state of being rather than a physical location. Though I'm saying that somewhat incautiously, so I'm conceding my own ignorance there.
Can people choose to do evil in heaven?
No.
Okay. So if people can choose not to do evil in heaven, why is it the case that people cannot choose or can choose to do evil here?
Because salvation is attained by, well, one, again, this is depending on the tradition that you're a part of, the means of salvation, even within a specific tradition. So I don't even, again, I will say that as part of the limits of philosophical reasoning about God, these are not questions, strictly speaking, for the domain of God. And if we want to discuss that further in the general discussion, I'd be more than happy to do so.
Well, my time is up now, so.
Well, there we go. We can segue right into.
Yeah. So now we have 10 minutes for open discussion. 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, I have approximately 10 minutes written down. I think if I wouldn't mind going over if I'm.
Yeah, I think if we overshoot a little bit, that'd be fine. But yeah, I'm ready whenever you are. You can feel free to start off the discussion.
Yeah, well, let's go back to this perfect world business. I would just pose to you, what does a perfect world look like, and at what standard are you appealing to when you talk about a perfect world?
Well, I think that if we're discussing what a perfect world is, I don't think that I would know exactly what a perfect world would look like, but I think that it's possible that there's a possible world that is perfect. And so if there's a possible world that is perfect, then it means that it's possible that this world could be perfect. And
so you're
not.
So can you comprehend of this perfect world? Can you talk about it? Is there a standard to which you can appeal, or is it just a possible world, just kind of a general abstract concept that really?
Well, for starters, I think that this perfect world would be absent of any of the suffering that we see today, and there also wouldn't be any of this defect in the world today. Like, so we have biological defects that for some reason you have anencephalic babies. I think that's how you would say it. That are born. Those are babies that are born without their brain, and that causes a lot of suffering. So it doesn't seem to me that under classical theistic conception, if you do have this perfect creator, obviously you couldn't do any actions that are imperfect, and that's the whole point of the theistic conception. But then again, you get to the question of then why does this imperfection exist? And so that's why for me still too, like I would still ask if heaven is a perfect place for you, then whatever you could scratch whatever I mean from a perfect world. But if heaven is a perfect place for you, why isn't that world? Why aren't we currently living in that world? Why is it that we're made to suffer?
Again, I'm really struggling with this term perfect. I don't, because it feels like you're equivocating a little bit. On the one hand, you're talking about this perfect world and you're equating suffering and defect and inadequacy and so on with this perfection. So it sounds like you have some idea of what a perfect world would be, but when pressed on to what standard do you hold this perfect world? I don't, is this like a metaphysical view you're talking about? Is this a philosophical view? Like I'm having trouble understanding what perfection means without kind of a background of
well, I think
standard.
Well, like I said, I think
it's to say that it's evident that, oh, this is suffering, therefore it's bad, therefore this is not perfect. That's all well and good, but that needs to be done against, as far as I can see it, again, done a backdrop of some sort of standard. And I just don't know on what ground we stand with that.
Well, I think what I'm getting at least is just, I don't know exactly what what this perfection would look like in a perfect world. And
But this is not it.
But it doesn't seem so, especially when you have these when you have, let's say, needless suffering. Let's say like William Rose Fawn example of the fawn needlessly suffering. It doesn't seem that any greater good comes about of that, and it would seem improbable that that there is this all-powerful, perfect, loving being that would allow for such for needless and pointless suffering. And especially if you acknowledge that there is a place in which suffering doesn't happen, and that doesn't take away from anything, and that even moral evils, those cannot be committed, because all good is already there. It doesn't seem to be the case on why is it that that's not the case now? Why is it that we have to commit certain evils, or certain evils have to happen when apparently good awaits? And so that contradiction doesn't seem to be fleshed out or figured out, I would say.
Right. Well, it is figured out in the various religious traditions in which that worship the monotheistic God. And again, back to my point earlier, I probably didn't express it very well in my initial rebuttal, so I apologize. But you can use, as far as I see it, so long as you have rational justification to do so with the individual arguments, the story, as it were, or the tradition, I'm not using story not here as a fiction, but as an actual playing out of what is predicted by these traditions, the Christian tradition in particular, as kind of a litmus, as it were, for and a search for answers as to why there is this apparent needless suffering and so on. So I think that, and again, this could very well go beyond the realm of reason. But I think it's a little bit premature to start talking about a contradiction in what the world is like and what God is like, without an expectation of what the world is like to begin with. Like why, like what to what standard are we appealing when we talk about the deficiencies of this world? And I would say also, that'll be my first point. The second point is, it seems as though, now I don't know your full thoughts on via negativa reasoning, but it seems like you're using that to actually via negativa to kind of to talk about perfection, right? There's this idea of perfection that is not exactly clear. Right? But we see that there are certain things like that this world, in your view, is not perfect.
Yeah, well, I would agree that at least
the way that you're going about describing perfection is in kind of this negative sense. Would that be an appropriate characterization?
It would seem that, I guess, yeah, what I would say for whatever the perfect world is, I don't think I can make any positive claims on it, but it seems that I can make some negative claims that, well, it's not whatever's going on currently. And so that seems to bring things at more of a concrete level. And that's why, too, like, I think that even speaking of God in the via negativa, I could grant that makes sense, because those are things that are concrete. I can, I'm hesitant to say this because I don't think that I can fully understand something that is immaterial. All I can experience are things that are material and in the natural world. So I can't fully grasp what it would mean for something not to be material or non-physical. But I think that with those, at least those terms are a little bit more concrete and substantive. Whereas if you have these positive terms that are good, but I can only use that in a way that's not the same way that I use it on an everyday basis, then it seems to be very, very hard to see how that relates, like good or things like all-knowing or all-powerful. At that point, it gets to be you get further removed from what this thing is supposed to be. And it doesn't seem like if that's the case, how can I really grasp what this thing is?
So are you dissatisfied with the Aristotelian argument because of its abstract conclusions?
No, I mean there are other reasons why I struggle with the Aristotelian argument, because I think that the premises do lead to the conclusion, and so it's not just the conclusion that I struggle with. So I'm glad that we actually got to the Aristotelian argument, because the one thing I still wanted to address was this concept of change as being the actualization of a potential.
Yes.
And so I guess I'd like a little bit more information on why is it that we should buy that change is the actualization of a potential.
Sure. So just a little bit of context, and I you know this, but I think it's worth fleshing out. In philosophical discourse, as distinct from other types of discourse, such as scientific discourse, is that it's at its most general and divorced from any particular circumstance, right? So the terminology of actual to potential is akin to talking about cause in general, or causality in general, or being in general. They're necessarily abstract terms. So you mentioned that there are different kinds of change. They could change color. They could change density and all sorts of other attributes. And I don't think that poses a challenge to the idea of potentiality and actuality, because again, that's the broad category under which they would fall. Just like we would say a certain enzyme in the body causing a certain reaction is the same thing as a lightning rod causing lightning to attract lightning. It's they're both distinct instances of cause and effect, but yet we still describe them as cause and effect. So that's kind of addressing your second point about different types of change. I think it's still perfectly adequate to arrive at the potentiality actuality. And remind me again, just of your specific product. Are you just not buying it, like the potentiality or actuality? You just want to know?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to understand why should I suppose that there is this metaphysical distinction between actuality and potentiality.
Yeah, it's actually
like why should I suppose? And I know you didn't bring this up in your debate, but like the metaphysical distinction between like essence and existence.
Yeah.
But I guess that so that way we don't get far removed from the conversation. Well, we could stick with just potentiality and actuality.
Sure. Again, potentiality and actuality is actually, I mean, although they're abstract necessarily as members of philosophical discourse, they come from our basic experience of things changing. So you say that it's self-evident that things change. So you accept that premise, correct?
Yeah, I think that things.
So the classic example is the one Phaser uses a lot is the coffee on my desk getting colder. Mm-hmm. Right. So you admit that it's at one temperature at 1 ton T, and at some time T+1, it's cooler, and we describe that using the second law of thermodynamics. Right. That's the way we describe what happens. So we would say, again, it just as a matter of description, that water, or sorry, that coffee rather, its potential, it already has within it the potential to become cooler. It will become cooler. We can actually predict that it will become cooler, right? But notice how it's distinct from other types of potentiality, or sorry, distinct from other types of actuality, where I can't expect my coffee to run my car as gasoline would, or to fly up out of the air, without anything touching it, because again, it has a construct that we can measure, and we can actually predict what it will do. So really, it's at bottom, or at least initially, it's a measure of description from the change that we experience in everyday things. That makes sense?
Yeah, well, I guess
it's basically a way of describing change.
I don't know why we'd have to say that I don't know why we'd have to say that the coffee is potentially cold, as opposed to just saying that it's just not cold, it's hot. But also, why, like, we don't know if something potentially is one way until it is one way.
Exactly.
Like, for example, I don't know that a rubber ball is potentially melted until I see it melt. And so that's the thing, is that I think that when it comes to this too, it almost seems that why isn't it that my dog isn't potentially talking? I mean, I've never seen it talk, but again, like I might see a dog and have never seen it run, but that doesn't mean it can't run.
Yep.
So why
coffee can't run my car? It's an abstract, or sorry, it's a metaphysical concept reached through inductive reasoning. So yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. You wouldn't just by inspection of a rubber ball before you burned it, unless you've never seen a rubber or anything rubber burned before, you're not expected to just arrive at the conclusion that it's going to start melting, right? It's through inductive reasoning we arrive at these abstract metaphysical terms based on our own everyday experience. So it's again we notice things. We notice, again, I'll go back to cause and effect, because I think it's kind of an analog to this potentiality actuality, although I'm sure there are some important differences. But again, we notice cause and effect all the time, and we we term the general phenomenon cause and effect. It's just as abstract, but it's based on our inductive reasoning and, again, our experience in the natural world.
And I guess going along with this idea of change, why isn't it that different types of change could have different kinds of causes? So I understand that the idea that there can't be more than one first cause, because if one of these causes, to distinguish between the two causes, one would need to have something that the other doesn't possess, or vice versa. And then that would be a deficiency that one has, or a potential that one has, that needs to be actualized. Then it wouldn't be a first cause. But couldn't there be different kinds of causes? I mean, for example, what causes something to change color isn't the same thing as something that causes something to get older. Or for me, for instance, whatever causes me to become darker, let's say, if I were to tan, it's not the same thing that causes me to age. And so, whereas one is the sun, one is the time. And it seems that if there are different causes that extend that way, you can arrive at different first causes for those things.
Not first causes, different efficient causes, to be sure. But again, you just yourself admit, like, again, it's worth keeping in mind that this is not a temporal argument, by the way. This is the hierarchical argument of actualizers, right? And then so things that, in order to maintain their existence, again, I don't know if this is where you were heading, but this is kind of the argument that things by virtue of their existence are actualized, but they themselves don't have the causal power to maintain their own existence, and therefore, and that's when you get to that bottom, a metaphysically necessary actualizer. But and again, to your point about different types of the examples that you gave, notice how you use the word cause and mention an effect in every sentence. So although you were talking about different instances, it was still about cause and effect. And I would say that the same thing applies for potentiality to actuality. Again, it's a metaphysical concept arrived at through our inductive reasoning that we have abstracted from any particular circumstance so that we can talk about it in general.
There was a question I had in mind, and then it just escaped me completely. I'm trying to think about what it was, because so, like, I can understand the concepts of cause and effect, but when it comes to potentiality and actuality, it doesn't seem that they need be the same thing, or that you need actuality and potentiality to explain cause and effect. If I can say that billiard ball A hitting billiard ball B will bring billiard ball B to the table, and so billiard ball A is the cause of billiard ball B being on the far end of the table. Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem that I need to bring in this language of actuality or potentiality into it. I could just say this caused this to happen, but this thing wasn't potentially going to happen and then it actually happened. I could just say that this is the cause and this is the effect.
Yeah, again, and this is why in scholastic metaphysics that this hierarchical chain is more important than the temporal chain, because oftentimes, as you just suggested, and I think you're correct, the overlap between cause and effect and potentiality to actuality, you can just describe the same thing in different terms.
So what's an example then of the hierarchical change?
Okay, so all right, let's go back to the coffee on the desk, right? So the coffee is made up of water and coffee grounds. Its molecular structure is organized in such a way that let's just take the water in the coffee grounds, right? So there's hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms, and then beneath those atoms are subatomic particles, quarks, and bosons, and who knows what, and who knows what we'll figure out. Okay, the argument goes that if, in order to maintain existence, right, at one point, again, I'm trying not to use temporal language here, but just for the purposes of argument, at one point in time, or any point in time, whatever, to maintain one's existence, there needs to be an actualizer that is apart from the actual thing. So it needs to be maintained, metaphysically speaking. So that's kind of the hierarchical vision. So anything that exists, whatever, needs a maintenance for its existence.
So I guess I would ask, why is it that thing can't maintain itself? So why isn't it that the coffee grounds can just be what they are and that maintains its own existence? Why does the first cause have to to stop after the material or naturalistic.
I mentioned.
I might have missed it, so I apologize for that.
No, it's okay. I didn't actually advance an argument because, again, I'm hopelessly out of my depth when it comes to this. But that is one of the metaphysical debates that kind of is attached to this argument in particular. I'm trying to find it here because I can never remember these. It's very jarring. There you go.
And I think after this point, we might wrap up.
Yeah. Sorry. The preliminary existential inertia thesis is exactly what you just advanced. The metaphysical view that things will necessarily, here I have it right in front of me here, necessarily temporal objects will continue to exist in the absence of causally destructive factors, whereas Phaser's argument, the one I just advanced, argues under the assumption of what's called the existential expiration thesis, or EET, and is in direct opposition to the aforementioned. It says necessarily temporal objects will cease to exist by means of instantaneous annihilation in the absence of causally sustaining factors. And there are various and sundry arguments in support of both of those. So I would say that you are either explicitly or implicitly relying on one of these theories. So if you're against
existential,
yeah, exactly. So that's kind of, you are relying on that metaphysical principle. And I would just say that, and maybe we can have a debate about defending that one, but I need to do a little more reading first on that. But yes.
I would too. So, but I think so. We actually doubled our discussion time. We're about 20
I figured we would. It's no big deal.
But I think that's good. I think this was a good debate. I'm going to finally step out of my devil's advocate role.
You did a very good job.
Thank you. And thank you guys for tuning in and watching with us. We're hoping to also record a little debrief video as well, so that way we can talk about our thoughts on the debate and the discussion. If you guys like to see that, let us know. But for now, that's going to conclude the debate. If you want to see more devil's advocate videos and anything of that sort, please let us know in the description. If there's any debate topics that you want us to talk about, let us know. And if there's any other discussion topics for our regular podcast episodes, please let us know. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please like, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, so that way you get updates on when we upload our next videos, and share with your friends, those who agree, those who disagree, those who don't care at all, but you should still share it with them anyway. And thank you for your time, and we really appreciate it. Have a good night, and God bless you all.